What other canonical texts are especially important in Confucian tradition?
A second collection called the Four Books, Su Shu, consists of very ancient texts eventually brought together during the Song dynasty, 960-1279 CE. Most famous of the four is a work commonly called the Analects, Lun Yu, a compilation of Confucius sayings and dialogues edited by second-generation disciples around 400 BCE. The Great Learning, De Shui, is a chapter excerpted from the Classic of Rites. Singled out now as a separate book because of its centrality to Confucian thought. Dating to about 350 BCE, this work is probably the single most important statement of Confucian views on the cultivation of the ideal human being, or superior person, essential to a harmonious society. Another excerpt from the Classic of Rites is now regarded as a separate book called The Doctrine of the Mean. Zhonyang, traditionally attributed to Confucius' grandson Zhusu. Its theme is the harmonious development of human nature by means of right action, and the principle of reciprocity as manifest in the five fundamental relationships. Finally, the Meng Zi includes the largely ethical and political teachings of Meng Zi, c. 372-289 BCE, commonly known as Mencius. He was one of the foundational figures in the interpretation of the classic literati themes expounded by Confucius. The book's 7 sections emphasize the need for vigilance in cultivating virtue, with the ultimate goal of living in harmony with the will, or mandate, of heaven. By about 1200 CE, the complete literati canon of texts included not only the 5 classics and the 4 books, but 4 other works considered to contain the essentials of Confucian and literati views on all things under heaven.
How would you sum up the history of Confucianism?
During the first couple of centuries after the time of Confucius, 2 major thinkers developed the beginnings of what we now call Confucianism. Mencius, or Meng Zi, 371-289 BCE, and Sun Zi, d. 215 BCE, codified the teachings of the master into the foundations of a political philosophy. Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, 221-210 BCE, displeased with the emerging movement, tried to suppress it by burning all the Confucian texts. Before that emperor died, in 210 BCE, he had succeeded in transforming feudal China into a centralized bureaucracy, but Confucianism survived. Under the new Han dynasty, 206 BCE to 20 CE, the state espoused Confucianism as its core ideology. Confucianism took institutional shape as a system for training the empire's bureaucrats and officials, thereby strengthening the cultural elite known as the literati. For the next several centuries, Confucianism's prestige dwindled as Buddhism's star rose with increasing imperial patronage. During the southern and northern, 265 to 581 CE, Sui, 581 to 618, and Tang dynasties. 618 to 906, Confucian ritual and literati authority held on. Criticizing Buddhism as an insidious import and enjoying sporadic periods of notoriety. Confucianism returned to prominence during the Song dynasty. 960-1279, as a result of the Neo-Confucian revival. Scholars finalized the canon of the 5 classics and 4 books, plus several subsidiary works. Official Neo-Confucian philosophies drifted away from traditional beliefs in a transcendent divine heaven, emphasizing ethics and social responsibility. But a cult centered around Confucius survived. During the last of the Chinese dynasties, the Qing, or Manchu, 1644 to 1911. A generally strong literati class continued to promote an increasingly static and dogmatic form of Confucian orthodoxy. The last emperor fell with the arrival of Sun Yat-sen's New Republic, and the literati became functionally obsolete. Still, the leaders of the Republic held Confucius up as the epitome of Chinese culture. When Mao Zedong's communist movement began its rise in the 1930s, the chairman declared himself fed up with Confucius and the old ways. In response, the Republican nationalist movement insisted that Confucianism represented all genuinely Chinese values. As the nationalists fled the mainland and established themselves in Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, overt acknowledgement of Confucian tradition went with them.
Is exorcism important in Daoist practice?
Many Daoist rituals are designed to expel, control, or pacify troublesome spirits, or, by extension, to banish drought, famine, or outlaws who might have been plaguing the local citizenry. Daoists rarely identify individual problems as personal cases of demonic, gui, possession. Much more common are instances in which a specialist's skills are required to liberate temples, homes, and business establishments from evil influences. Until some 30 years ago, Roman Catholic tradition included a specific ritual to ordain young candidates for the priesthood to the order of exorcist, one of 4 so-called minor orders. Ordination to the Daoist priesthood still includes an emphasis on the ability to perform exorcism as one of its essential features. Rare descriptions of demonic possession suggest some elements similar those described in Roman Catholic archival accounts of exorcism, including the need to have several stout attendants restrain the possessed person occasionally. After performing a variety of ritual actions, such as lighting candles and incense and burning the appropriate charm, the exorcist enjoins the spirit to depart and a contest of wills ensures. More common, indeed regularly scheduled, rites of temple purification may include dramatization of an encounter between the offending demon and the deity called Changkai, dispatcher of demons. after the demon, sometimes played by a member of the temple staff or a professional actor, steals an incense burner, the priest/deity subdues the evil one and returns the stolen item to the temple gods. Only through the dominance of yang over yin can a successful exorcism be carried out. A high moment occurs as the high priest drives the evil spirit out. To the accompaniment of intense sound from percussion instruments. Another method for ridding a building of an evil presence is to create billows of holy smoke by boiling oil and adding water to it.
What were the accomplishments of the Ming dynasty?
The focus on Chinese culture that was the hallmark of the Ming dynasty. 1368 to 1644 CE, was both its strength and its weakness. After the foreign Mongols, whose dynasty had been established by Kublai Khan in 1260, were overthrown as rulers of China in 1368. The Ming emperors returned their and their subjects' attention to those things that are distinctively Chinese. The focus on Chinese culture produced a brilliant flowering in the arts, evidenced by the name Ming itself meaning bright or brilliant. It was architects working during this period who produced the splendor of Beijing's Forbidden City. And though the Ming rulers promoted this artistic renaissance and reinstated Confucianism and the program of civil service suspended by the Mongols, the rulers' myopia prevented them from seeing the threat of the nomadic Manchu people. In 1644, the Manchus invaded from the north and conquered China, setting up the last dynastic period in Chinese history. It lasted until 1912.
What rites do worshippers practice in Daoist and CCT temples?
One of the most important and easily observable temple rituals involves the offering of incense. Worshippers buy 3 slender sticks of incense at a small temple shop that supplies a variety of materials for different sorts of offerings. Devotees can make their offerings either at the main altar or at any of a number of side or subordinate altars. Depending on the size of the temple and which deity they choose to address. Those who wish to worship at the main shrine may first approach the large incense kettle that normally stands in the central courtyard. Igniting their incense sticks, they hold them upright between folded hands, wave them before the deity, and bow from the waist toward the object of their devotion. After prayer they insert the handles of the burning incense wands into the sand and ashes in the kettle. On some occasions a devotee might have his or her sticks placed in a holder on an altar. Some take incense ash home for use as a curative medicine. Equally important is a more ritually generic type of devotional prayer in which devotees supplicate the various deities for favors. Worshippers generally kneel to address the chosen deity, praying either aloud or in silence, either bowing humbly or looking at the image. Offerings other than incense include a variety of foods. Most commonly fruits, rice, vegetables, wine, and sweets. When worshippers make such offerings, they often have a temple staff member light a candle for them on the altar. Toward the end of a typical episode of temple worship, devotees will burn symbolic imitation paper money as an offering. All temples provide one or more small furnaces in which worshippers offer gold paper to the deities and silver to ancestors. These burnt offerings symbolize personal sacrifice in hope of blessing and commitment to the ongoing well-being of departed family members.
What signs or symbols might identify someone as a deist or practitioner of CCT?
Symbols associated with religious beliefs and folk practices abound in societies heavily influenced by Chinese culture. Over the centuries, the major Chinese religious traditions Taoist, Confucian, Buddhist, and popular have shared many of those symbols and signs. Overlapping of symbols of various traditions makes it difficult, if not impossible, to know at a glance to which tradition the owner and user of the symbols belongs. Signs and symbols generally associated with CCT include a vast range of protective and magical devices, amulets, and talismans. Perhaps the most widely used symbol is that of the perfect harmony of yin and yang, appearing on all sorts of personal items such as rings and pendants. The so-called Taiji, Supreme Ultimate, is a circle in which two equal but opposite curving tear shapes embrace. In other words, an S-curve line divides the circle in two equal parts. The darker half symbolizes yin, the brighter half yang, but the commingling of the two is symbolized by a dark dot in the larger end of the yang shape and a corresponding bright dot in the yin shape. Sometimes, as on the national flag of South Korea, that symbol is surrounded by the 8 trigrams, Bagwa. The trigrams are made up of combinations of solid yang lines and broken yin lines. Charm-like devices are extremely popular in Chinese societies. Textiles and other decorative items, like ceramic wares, invariably display a range of symbolic features. Symbols they show can include any of dozens of animal, plant, or inanimate objects associated with aspects of the greatest mysteries of life, of those things that human beings most hope for or fear. For example, the tortoise and crane mean long life, the dragon means protection, the phoenix warmth. The heron and countless other birds of good omen betoken happiness, while creatures of ill omen, such as the owl, portend death and bad fortune.
What is ancestor veneration and what is its connection with Daoism or CCT?
Concern over maintaining the integrity of one's connections with family. Lineage is one of the hallmarks of Chinese religious and social life. Members of each family line male descendants from a shared ancestor, with wives attached to their husband's line, acknowledge both the continued spiritual presence and the sacredness of their forebears. Their reasons are many: expression of grief, assistance of the deceased in his or her struggles beyond the grave, the desire for blessings, feeling a sense of family cohesiveness, showing continued affection for the dead. Long after the funeral and an extended period of official mourning, families pay homage to the dead both at the cemetery and at the ancestral shrine in the home. There, on the altar table, the family preserves a set of tablets, each with the name of one deceased relative inscribed on it. In very wealthy families of times past, the oldest son would dedicate his life to looking after the proper performance of the rites, foregoing virtually all other activities. For most families today, ongoing activities include chiefly the regular visits to the cemetery, annual refurbishment of the grave for the feast called Clear and Bright, Qingming, and daily prayers at the home shrine. At home, family members make the same kinds of symbolic offerings to the ancestors as to the deities enshrined on the domestic altar. Very wealthy families have often built special ancestral temples as major monuments to the spiritual power of the dead. Few, if any, of these practices or specific concerns are uniquely deist. It is all part of the broadly Chinese religious patrimony, with some elements perhaps more closely linked to CCT than to any specific major tradition.
What does alchemy have to do with Daoism?
A complex system of practices known as outer, Nei Dan, and inner, Wei Dan. Alchemy developed for the purpose of allowing practitioners to achieve earthly longevity and perhaps complete immortality. While the outer form works with chemicals and other substances, the inner form focuses on cultivation of the divine within each person by a variety of techniques. The goal is to transform all three of the individual vital forces into the pure spirit called Shen. Daoist alchemy consists of countless intricate formulas and recipes involving cinnabar, jade, and gold. Initiates must virtually soak enough of these elements into their systems to render the body indestructible. A method called gold cinnabar Daoism spells out the details of a technique shared by various schools of alchemy. A regimen of physical exercises called Qigong, now even more popular than Tai Chi Chuan, is historically related to classical Daoist inner alchemy. Requirements such as the consumption of specific numbers of potions and pills on devilishly difficult schedules make the goal all but impossible to reach. But if the pharmaceutical demands were not enough, there is an even more elusive ethical component. For example, a person who desires immortality must perform an uninterrupted chain of charitable acts. 1,200 according to one ancient source. One stumble invalidates the process and requires a fresh start. Descriptions of deist alchemy too often leave out this ethical component. A feature that says more about the underlying spirit of the quest than any mere list of chemicals can begin to suggest. Although it is easy enough to see how an alchemical search for immortality could easily deteriorate into a crassly magical pursuit, the classical sources still have the power to remind one that beneath it all is serious insight into the human condition.
What is the Analects of Confucius?
Excerpts from Book 2 of the Analects. 1. The Master said, "He who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place and all the stars turn towards it." The Master said, "If the people be led by the laws, and uniformity sought to be given them by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment, but they have no sense of shame. If they be led by virtue, and uniformity sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, they will have the sense of shame, and moreover will become good." The Master said, "At 15, I had my mind bent on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I knew the decrees of heaven. At 60, my ear was an obedient organ for the reception of truth. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired, without transgressing what was right." Mang Idza asked what filial piety was. The Master said, "It is not being disobedient." Soon after, as Fan Chih was driving him, the Master told him, saying, "Mang I asked me what filial piety was, and I answered him, not being disobedient." Fan Chih said, "What did you mean?" The Master replied, that parents, when alive, should be served according to propriety, that, when dead, they should be buried according to propriety, and that they should be sacrificed to according to propriety. 10. The Master said, "See what a man does. Mark his motives. Examine in what things he rests."
How do deists worship at home and throughout the day when they are not in temples?
Worshippers perform at home many of the same rituals they perform in the temple. Home shrines or family altars are miniature versions of the temple's sacred objects. Smaller images of the various deities enjoy places of honor. Before the image, family members place a few apples or oranges, for example. And small incense pots hold small burning sticks just as the kettle in the temple courtyard does. Many devout Chinese begin their day by offering incense to the terrestrial deity of the home, who is sometimes depicted as 5 separate figures recalling the 5 elements. This earth deity is at the bottom of an administrative flow chart, reporting to the district deity, who in turn reports to the city god, and he to the country god. Offerings to family ancestors and consultation with an almanac as to The spiritual qualities of the particular day are other regular rituals. Many private individuals still practice Tai Chi Chuan, a set of rhythmic movements designed to balance yin and yang and maximize energy.
What are trigrams and hexagrams?
Trigrams are sets of 3 vertically stacked horizontal lines made up of every possible combination of broken and solid line. Solid lines stand for the solar male yang, hot, bright, active, and dry. Broken lines stand for the earthy and lunar female yin, which is dark, moist, mysterious, and associated with valleys. Combinations of yin and yang in varying proportions give rise to the 8 essential elements in creation. Traditional presentations usually arrange the 8 trigrams as an octagon, at whose center stands the Tai Chi symbol for perfect yin-yang harmony. Each trigram is arrayed so as to face its opposite in the set. So for example, if you held a compass before you with north pointing up, heaven's 3 solid lines would stand across from earth's 3 broken lines at what would be north and south. At due east stands water, with a solid line between a pair of broken lines, across from fire, with its broken line sandwiched between solids in the west. At northwest, lake's broken solid, reading from top to bottom, stands across from mountains solid broken. And in the northeast, wind's solid broken balances off thunder's broken solid. Take the 8 trigrams and arrange them in all possible permutations by stacking one trigram atop another, and you get 64 hexagrams. Pile heaven upon heaven and the result is called the creative principle. Add earth to earth and you get the passive principle. Earth over heaven yields peace, while heaven over earth means stagnation. The single most important source for interpreting these arcane indicators is the I Ching, the classic of change. Tossing and rearranging a set of 50 sticks and then reading them as hexagrams with the help of that text remains a widely popular form of divination.
Has Daoism ever been associated with millennialism or messianic movements?
Several major movements of a millenarian and messianic cast have been associated with Daoism. One occurred during the late 2nd century CE under the leadership of the 3 Zhang brothers who claimed authority in the domains of heaven, earth, and humanity. They espoused a type of Daoism called Huang Lao, possibly a combination of the first parts of the names of Huang Di, the Yellow Emperor, and Lao Zi, and claimed divine origins for their eschatologically charged sacred text, the highest peace scripture. The brothers Zhang established a theocracy, complete with elaborate hierarchies. Toward the end of the 2nd century the movement swelled into full-scale rebellion led by a military force called the Yellow Turbans. The rebellion fizzled even though its leaders considered 184 CE an ideal time. Beginning as it did a fresh 60-year cycle. Shortly after that ill-fated rebellion in the east, another Zhang from an unrelated family organized a theocratic state that lasted from 186 to 216 CE. This Zhang Lu claimed the authority of his grandfather Zhang Daoling, 34 to 156 CE. Traditionally cited as the founder of the first Daoist religious movement, the Celestial Masters School. Both theocracies hoped to re-establish the utopian regimes they believed had existed in the past. After the 4th century, new and more powerful movements emerged, with various leaders claiming to be incarnations of a divinized Lao Zi, called Li Heng. All taught the expectation of a messiah and a final battle which only the elect would survive, to live on in their religious utopia. None had long-term repercussions. Loosely related by symbolism to the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 was the typing, highest peace. Rebellion of 1850-64. It was a syncretistic movement that borrowed heavily from Christian millennialist imagery.
What is the historical and religious significance of Tiananmen Square?
In June of 1989, media coverage of the so-called Tiananmen Square massacre brought world prominence to one of China's most important public spaces. The huge plaza stands directly south of the Forbidden City and is named after the city's massive southern outer gate. The Gate of Heavenly Peace, Tiananmen, literally Heaven Peace Gate. In a matter of days the space had become a globally recognized symbol for a younger China's struggle for democracy. But Tiananmen Square had been a powerful symbol for the Chinese people for some years before 1989. Early revolutionary publications spoke of the place as the people's guiding star, the emblem of the new China. Situated just south of the ancient seat of empire, the square was created as a clear revolutionary response to imperial repression. The open People's Square was an obvious counterpoint to the exclusivity and mystery of the Forbidden City. Its placement to the south of the palace also meant that the square overpowered the palace by virtue of its greater access to yang energy, a symbolism surely not lost on countless traditional Chinese. Mao Zedong and his communist colleagues preferred to play off their new symbols of power against the old. They could have chosen simply to destroy the trappings of the decadent regime, but they might thereby have risked investing the former symbols with even greater power in the popular imagination. Better to reduce them to the status of mere museums. In the square now stand Communist Beijing's Great Hall of the People and the Museums of Chinese History and of the Chinese Revolution. Contemporary replacements for the old imperial symbolism. Between them and to the south stands the mausoleum of Chairman Mao, d. 1976, but facing north rather than south as the imperial centers had done for over 3,000 years. The goal of countless pilgrims today, Mao's Memorial Hall functions as a quasi-religious monument even in its rejection of China's imperial religious tradition.
Do Daoists and practitioners of CCT believe in heaven and hell?
Since long before the beginnings of religious Daoism, the notion of heaven, Tian, as an impersonal transcendent reality has been very important to the Chinese. Some Daoists have identified heaven as the first materialization, or a kind of emanation, of the Dao's spiritual power. In this sense, heaven becomes an intermediary between the unmanifest Dao and all of creation. For heaven is the source of all good things. Along with earth and humanity, heaven is one of the three powers that bring about life as we know it. However, Daoists do not generally talk of heaven as the eternal abode of those who lived virtuously on earth. One region beyond ordinary earthly experience is the Isles of the Blessed, Pen Lai Shan. In the far reaches of the Eastern Sea, where the eight immortals dwell amid an idyllic landscape. Many Chinese express the hope of finally reaching the Isles and attain immortality there. Belief in retribution after death for a less than praiseworthy life has given rise to a wealth of imagery. But Daoism and CCT call hell a multi-storied earthly prison. There are 10 levels of hell. Some prefer to talk of 10 separate hells, each with its ruling deity. They function rather like the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno, each designated for those who commit specific sins and crimes. Presiding over the first level is a sort of chief judge, who wields authority over the other 9 judge kings. Some souls never make it to their assigned hell, a difficult passageway to the hope of better things beyond that. They spend eternity wandering aimlessly and forever hungry, dependent on the kindness of the living to attend to their needs. Some sources talk of hell much as many Christians describe purgatory as temporary suffering with long-range benefits.
What is Neo-Confucianism?
During the Song dynasty, 960-1279 CE, Confucian tradition underwent a kind of renaissance. Buddhism and Daoism had both developed into powerful influences at all levels of Chinese life and culture. A host of talented Confucian scholars reinterpreted their tradition in light of and in dialogue with Buddhist and Daoist concepts. 3 10th and 11th century scholars pioneered what has come to be known in China as learning of principle, Li Shui, and beyond Asia as Neo-Confucianism. Sun Fu, 922-1057, Shikia, 1005-45, and Hu Yuan, 933-1059, transformed and revitalized the Confucian curriculum, thus paving the way for later teachers in their movement. Zhou Dunyi, 1017-73, continued the dramatic changes by developing Li as a spiritual or metaphysical principle rather than as simply a term for propriety in relationships and ritual. He and his successors expanded Confucian teaching into a full-scale cosmological system. Zhu Xi, 1130 to 1200, is the Thomas Aquinas of the school in the sense that he synthesized the teachings of his predecessors into his own carefully coordinated system. Zhu Xi became a sort of lightning rod for subsequent generations of scholars, all of whom had to account for his pioneering thought one way or another.
Apart from the trigrams and taiji, what are some common traditional symbols?
Ancient lore associates fundamental features of Chinese cosmology with specific symbols. It all goes back to the Chinese atom, Pangu. In his task of imposing order on primal chaos, Pangu enlisted the help of 5 cosmic assistants: Azure Dragon, White Tiger, Phoenix, Tortoise, and Unicorn. Pangu assigned to each of the first 4 a quarter of the universe. Azure Dragon governed the east, associated with spring, new life, benevolence, and protection. White Tiger ruled the autumnal west, symbol of maturity and a life well spent. All made possible by good government and courage. Phoenix, the ultimate solar bird, presided over the summery south with the kindly warmth and joy that arises in a world at peace. Hard-shelled and indomitable, the ageless tortoise faced the unforgiving, wintry north. Wandering freely among them all, the rare and delicate unicorn was commissioned to appear wherever and whenever benevolence and justice reigned on earth. It is not surprising that all 5 of these wondrous beings retain their appeal to the popular imagination and remain essentials of the religious symbolic repertoire. A cluster of items associated loosely with Daoism are called the 8 Daoist emblems. Each represents one of the 8 immortals, a group of human beings who became immortal in various ways. They appear often as decorative motifs on all kinds of objects. The emblems are a fan, a sword, a gourd, castanets, a flower basket, a bamboo drum, a flute, and a lotus flower. This is one of several sets of 8 motifs popular in Chinese art and, along with the 8 Buddhist emblems, one that still carries specifically religious resonances.
How can a man conceal his character?
Qi Kangzi asked how to cause the people to reverence their ruler, to be faithful to him, and to go on to nerve themselves to virtue. The master said, "Let him preside over them with gravity, then they will reverence to him. Let him be filial and kind to all, then they will be faithful to him. Let him advance the good and teach the incompetent, then they will eagerly seek to be virtuous."
What is the relationship between Daoism and martial arts?
Early each morning, nearly everywhere in China, people gather in public places both large and small to practice a slow graceful routine of physical movements called Tai Chi Chuan. People of all ages can engage in this activity. Though it is not strenuous the way higher speed exercises can be, Tai Chi, also commonly spelled Tai Chi, nevertheless puts noticeable demands on an astonishingly wide range of muscles all over the body. The idea is not simple physical toning, however, even though that is an obvious benefit. Its purpose is to maintain or restore one's overall sense of health and well-being through relaxed concentration. Proper practice relieves blockages of vital energy and returns the whole person to balance and harmony both physically and spiritually. Tai Chi routines and styles are varied, with three methods called Chen, Wu, and Yang most common nowadays. Many of the underlying principles in the practice are of Taoist origin and remain a regular part of the regimen in many Taoist monasteries. But it seems more reasonable on the whole to identify Tai Chi as a more generically Chinese phenomenon, since for centuries non-Taoists have made use of it with no apparent direct connection with Taoist beliefs. As for its relationship to actual martial arts, Tai Chi movement is based on the notion that non-aggressiveness, what is called being weak like water, is ultimately more effective than trying to overwhelm one's opponent with brute force. Hence, for example, the Japanese term judo derives from a Chinese term, rodeo, that means the way of yielding.
What are some clues to understanding Taoist and CCT images?
By far the majority of Taoist and CCT images of sacred figures are portrayed with identifiably human bodies. They rarely have multiple heads or limbs, but they do have various special features. Deities are more often than not somber, sometimes of downright forbidding countenance, and typically depicted in such a way that the viewer is not likely to think of them as ordinary human beings. Bright red or yellow skin, flaring nostrils, riveted gaze, and the occasional menacing gesture discourage a too casual approach. Exceptions are some of the CCT deities who appear as gently smiling family members, kindly aunts or grandparents, for example. But even they often have unusual skin tones, suggesting that these are not mere mortals. Some deities are recognizable, at least by association, because of the groupings in which they appear. Most important in this respect is the triad formation, generally depicting a main central figure flanked by two slightly smaller figures. Depending on the temple, these may depict any of several of the triadic variations mentioned above. Many temples install subordinate deities and semi-divine powers on side altars or in small rooms of their own along the inner perimeter of the main courtyard. Each deity has his or her distinguishing characteristics, but one generally finds fewer clear iconographic clues here than in Hindu or Buddhist art. For example, several deities may sport the same skin tones, and facial expression and even carry very similar symbols. It is therefore sometimes impossible to discern individual identities of the characters without knowing in advance to whom a given temple is dedicated.
Were Confucians in conflict with their emperor?
In 213 BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang accepted the recommendation of his prime minister, Li Si, that all books except the history books about Qin be burned. Li made this recommendation to strengthen Qin's authority and to give him greater control over the scholarly class. All the books of lyrics and the writings of the various schools of thought were to be brought to governors of prefectures for burning, those who had these books and would not burn them within 30 days were to have their faces branded, then be sent to labor for 4 years on the Great Wall. Those who dared to talk about these books were to be executed. Those who quoted the past to criticize the present were to be killed together with their entire families. Those who knew of and did not report violations were to suffer the same punishment. The only books that were not to be burned, apart from histories of Qin, were books on medicine, divination, and tree planting. During the next year, 212 BCE, some Confucian scholars and magicians talked among themselves, accusing the emperor of being power-hungry, prone to kill and punish, and neglectful of intellectuals. When Qin Shi Huang learned of their dissent, he ordered a thorough investigation, during which the scholars blamed each other, rather than admitting to the criticisms. Finally, it was discovered that more than 460 scholars were involved. Qin Shi Huang ordered them all buried alive in the capital.
Is divination important to deists and practitioners of CCT?
Divinatory rites are more critical to Daoism and CCT than to many other major traditions. Long before Daoism came into being as a distinct set of traditions, the Chinese practiced divination through the stars, yarrow sticks, oracle bones, and tortoise shells. Important types of divination are the celestial, the terrestrial. Interpretations of events and omens, and the forecasting of individual destinies. Celestial divination, a variety of astrological interpretation, plots the locations of stars according to one of the 12 palaces associated with the lunar month of one's birth in order to understand a host of factors including sickness and health, luck, family issues, and personality. Terrestrial divination uses an elaborate geomantic compass to assist practitioners in aligning their lives most effectively with the forces of nature. All ordinary events in the life of each person have their hidden meanings, and special divinatory skills allow one to interpret the nature of the energy played out in all events in relation to the specific time of day or year. Some events clearly have ominous qualities and require specialized interpretative skills. Thunder or lightning and other natural events suggest forces that set them aside from more mundane happenings. Perhaps the most important and widespread forms of divination are those that help people divine their personal destinies. Some focus on reading physical features, such as facial characteristics or palm lines. Here we are moving away from strictly Daoist teaching and into popular practice.
Are number, color, or nature symbolism important in Daoist tradition and CCT?
Astrological calculation and cosmological imagery have long been an integral part of Chinese religious views. Hundreds of symbolic elements make up this vast system of correspondences. Zodiacal animals are associated with the 12 months. Each of the 4 quadrants of the universe has its 7 constellations in addition to its connection with specific trigrams, all related to particular aspects of good fortune or difficulty. Each of these elements is further coordinated with one of the 5 symbolic colors: black, white, red, green, yellow, and elements: wood, water, earth, metal, fire, and organs of the human body. Here are some examples of popular animal symbolism. The crow, surprisingly perhaps, symbolizes the sun. The crane, guide of the immortals, means long life, as do the dove and the hare. Fish are reminders of renewal of life and abundance. By association with plowing new fields, the ox means spring and vitality. The sharp-eyed, quick-tongued parrot looks after faithfulness in marriage. Flowers, trees, and fruits almost always have some symbolic resonance. The springtime peony means tenderness and womanly beauty, as does the jasmine. The plum means winter and reminds of Lao Zi, who was born beneath a plum tree. Bamboo Beidouken's endurance, the orange benevolence. A complete listing would fill several books. Of course, not everyone thinks consciously of specific symbolic meanings upon seeing any of the hundreds of visual decorative motifs in the full catalogue. But most Chinese still grow up surrounded by countless symbolic associations of this kind.
How do Daoists and practitioners of CCT today determine their destinies with divination?
Most common of the methods are those that involve the use of bamboo sticks and crescent-shaped blocks. In CCT temples, devotees approach a barrel crammed full of long sticks containing combinations of trigrams called hexagrams, or, alternatively, numbers from 1 to 64, the total number of combinations of the 8 trigrams. Grabbing a handful of sticks, they shake them and then let them fall back into the barrel. Invariably one stick will protrude above the rest, and it provides the critical symbol for that individual to interpret. When sticks are numbered, Devotees request a corresponding slip of paper from the temple staff. On the paper they then read an often enigmatic or poetic interpretation of the corresponding hexagram. Devotees can also drop a pair of crescent-shaped blocks with one smooth side symbolizing yang and one convex side symbolizing yin. Devotees pose questions as they drop the blocks. One yang and one yin side up means yes, while the other combinations mean no. Worshippers unsatisfied with a particular answer may simply continue dropping blocks until they receive the desired response.
Did Confucian tradition spread beyond China?
Confucian themes pervade the cultures of both Korea and Japan. Temples dedicated to Confucius have never been nearly as numerous in either country as Buddhist temples or Shinto shrines. For example, and today very few active ones remain. But the influence of the master is still discernible everywhere. Much of that influence is due to a long history of cultural and diplomatic relations between China and Korea. As early as the 7th century, Korean rulers welcomed Confucian thought as a master plan for political administration. Under the Koryo dynasty, 918-1392 CE, Confucianism took its place alongside of divination and Buddhism as the third in a triad of essential traditional teachings. Korean Confucianism reached its zenith during the long-lived Yi dynasty, 1392 to 1910. There was a time, Koreans occasionally point out, when even the Chinese confessed that their Korean neighbors had outdone them in devotion to Confucius. In Seoul, a Confucian university called Sungkyunkwan remains an important symbol of the tradition's impact on Korea. Confucian tradition came to Japan via Korea around 400 CE, a century and a half before Buddhism. Early Confucian scholars brought Chinese ideas to the Japanese imperial court, diffusing concepts that would go on to become an integral part of Japanese culture. Today the once elegant Confucian temple in downtown Tokyo has few visitors and is badly in need of repair. But Confucian ideals of family and social relationships are still part of the cultural air the Japanese people breathe.
Has Confucianism ever been intimately identified with specific political regimes?
Confucian teaching offers a great deal of reflection on the nature of an orderly society and methods of governing. It is therefore not surprising that a number of political regimes have chosen the Confucian system as their official ideology. Emperor Wu Di, r. 140–87 BCE, of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE 220 CE, was the first to do so, paving the way for a long and complex association between Confucian teaching and Chinese government. In Korea, Confucianism became the official religion of Korea by Decree of the Yi, 1392–1910, dynasty in 1392, to Buddhism's detriment. Leaders condemned Buddhism's view of this world as illusory and argued for the more humanistic approach of Confucian tradition. Perhaps the most far-reaching result was that education toppled from its elite pedestal and became available to a wide public. Confucianism took somewhat longer to forge its links to the Japanese imperial government. During the Tokugawa period, 1600 to 1868, after the capital had moved to Tokyo, Confucian tradition enjoyed its closest association with Japanese imperial rule. Particularly in the realm of international relations, the legacy of Confucian political thought stood out. Confucians played an important role in the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which involved a restructuring of imperial administration. As the Japanese grew to regard Confucianism as an unwelcome import, the tradition's official influence in governmental circles diminished steadily.
What are some other important celebrations for Daoism and CCT?
Daoists observe days special to the three officials, or officers or rulers, whom CCT call Shun, Yao, and Yu, on the 15th days of the 1st, 7th, and 10th lunar months. Their days are associated respectively with heaven, earth, and water. The heavenly official, Shun, ranks highest and remains very popular in Taiwan, for example. The water official, Yu, is celebrated for having saved the world from uncontrolled flooding. Three Daoist deities considered at the pinnacle of the pantheon are known as the three primordials. Their festival days coincide with those of the three officials, respectively. The first two of which also coincide with the CCT Lantern Festival and Ghost Festival.
What signs or symbols distinguish Daoist ritual specialists?
Daoist priests or masters make extensive use of symbolic vestments in ritual settings, apparently in imitation of the garments emperors once wore for religious rituals. Daoist specialists today wear three types of vestments in various colors, depending on sectarian affiliation. For the most sacred occasions, a high priest wears a square red silk poncho-like vestment called the garment of descent that symbolizes earth. For regular major rituals, the celebrants might wear a red or yellow silk overgarment called the Dao gown with the character for Taiji or the 8 trigrams on front and back. Other common decorative motifs include images of the 8 immortals, often depicted on the hems of broad, flowing sleeves. Abstract cloud designs often stand for yin, while cranes and male versions of the mythical creature called the Qilin, sometimes associated with the unicorn, but very different from the European unicorn, represent yang. For penitential rites, the assistants might wear the sea blue vestment whose darker color accords with a darker ritual purpose. Under these garments specialists wear a square silk apron. Officiants also wear distinctive headgear, including a black skull cap under a metal five-pointed crown. Recalling the 5 elements, bestowed in the ordination ceremony. Ritual shoes like those once worn in the imperial court bear cloud symbolism that suggests the ability to walk the very heavens as the priest delivers the prayers of the people to the deities.
What were the accomplishments of the Tang dynasty?
The Tang, 617 to 907 CE, was the sixth to last Chinese dynasty. It is well known because the period saw great achievements in government and business as well as in letters and the arts. Considered a golden age of Chinese civilization, the Tang was also an age of great expansion. At its height, the empire stretched from Turkmenistan in the west to Korea, which was a vassal state, in the east, and from Manchuria to northern India. One historian called the Tang the consummate Chinese dynasty, formidable, influential, and innovative. One of the Tang's innovations was the balance of administrative power. Government was separated into 3 main branches. The Imperial Secretariat, which organized the emperor's directives into policies. The Imperial Chancellery, which reviewed the policies and monitored the bureaucracy. And the Department of States and Affairs, which carried out the policies through the administration of 6 ministries. One of the most forward-thinking developments of the Tang dynasty was the growth of a civil service. Candidates for public service were trained in the Confucian principles before they took an examination that would qualify them for official duty.
Are statues and other visual imagery important in Daoist and CCT temples?
With the notable exception of major Confucian and imperial temples. Chinese ritual spaces are almost always filled with images of deities and other sacred figures. Principal deities occupy main altar spaces, but they often share the central spot with smaller images of other sacred figures arranged below the main image and toward the front of the altar. For many centuries Daoists and practitioners of CCT evidently felt no need for anthropomorphic depictions of their deities. The advent of Buddhism, with its growing iconographic repertoire, seems to have been an important factor in the development of Chinese religious representational imagery. Images of Daoist deities, and of those that originated outside Daoist circles but are often identified as Daoist by association, run a wide gamut. Some of the deities are of divine origin. Others began as human beings, either historical or legendary, and achieved divine status either in life or after death. In addition to statues, colorful banners, low relief in stone and other media, and mural paintings depict mythological and other scenes meant to keep the worshipper in the proper frame of mind. Even temples that began as Buddhist institutions and which still display distinctively Buddhist imagery in their main shrines and altars have often become transformed into CCT temples by accretion over the centuries. Whatever the individual deity's life history, anthropomorphic images abound.
What is the link between Feng Shui and Daoism?
Feng Shui, a term meaning wind and water, is a type of terrestrial divination designed to help practitioners make practical decisions about living arrangements that will be in harmony with natural energies and forces. This symbolic system coordinates critical elements of time and space to allow for maximum harmony in every conceivable human interaction with nature. All natural features, including trees, rivers, mountains, and valleys, for example, have their distinctive influences on the flow of energy. Failure to take of these forces into account can make life much more difficult than it need be. In practical terms, Feng Shui assists people most of all in choosing the orientation and design of the built environment, in other words, architecture and urban planning. A geomantic compass allows people to arrange the spaces in which they live and work in accordance with the principle of the 9 palaces. The compass indicates where yin and yang energies flow. A grid of 9 squares, each of which contains 3 numbers from 1 to 9, can be used in connection with building plans to indicate optimum placement of particular kinds of spaces within a home or office, e.g. storage, study, eating, or sleeping spaces. This ancient environmentalist system has grown from careful observation of the consequences of human interaction with the greater cosmos. Chinese tradition emphasizes the need to conform with the way of nature rather than attempting to dominate it.
Is there a standard Daoist group liturgical worship?
Most of the ritual activity one can observe at temples throughout the day consists of individual or family worship at various times during the day. Members of pious organizations may gather for group chanting of liturgical prayers. The priest may address a sermon to such gatherings as well. Major Daoist sects have devised their own special communal rituals, and some have survived intact into our time and are still practiced, especially in rural areas and more traditional villages. Many of these involve group chanting of sacred texts, in imitation of the chanting of the assembled gods themselves when they created the universe. One important communal ritual is that based on the teachings of the Lingbao sect. Elaborate theatrical liturgies address issues and powers in 3 levels or registers: the celestial, the terrestrial, and the human. The Golden Register of Rituals honors the family of the emperor at the celestial level. A terrestrial level called the Yellow Register is aimed at peaceful rest for the deceased. The now discontinued Jade Register once focused on securing salvation for all people. The officiants and their ritual implements mediate between the divine and human participants. Rites once dedicated to the emperor and his court are now undertaken on behalf of local or family groups known to uphold religious standards. Observances begin with an evening or vespers prayer to announce the start of the rituals and symbolically reconstruct a sacred realm in which to enact the rites. Great attention goes into setting the ritual scene. A miniature of the cosmos with gates at the 4 cardinal directions. Action resumes the next morning with a fast and an offering. Imitating a creative divine act, the officiant recreates the sacred space by pacing out creation and journeys symbolically to the heavens to bring down heavenly powers. As part of the ritual, the master, or priest, meditates silently, focusing on visual imagery as a way of bringing health to the assembled people. The entire ritual ends on the next day with the master facing the assembly as one now returned to earth. He then dismantles the altar, burns the sacred texts, and sends the deities back to their heavenly abodes.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in deist worship and prayer?
Specific lists of objects vary somewhat among the different schools and sects. Here are the most important ritual devices of the Celestial Masters school. First and foremost are the ubiquitous talismans that consist of a written magical formula or mantras symbolizing a contract between the deities and human beings engaging in a ritual exchange. Only a qualified ritual specialist may execute a talisman, which usually includes a specially drawn Chinese character as well as other visual symbols appropriate to a particular spiritual purpose. Possessors of talismans generally think of them as guarantees of divine aid. People wear them or hang them in home or office to attract positive energies. The precious sword of the 7 stars, symbolizing the Big Dipper, appears often in blessings and exorcisms, whether for individuals or as part of cosmic renewal observances. As a symbolic purification to the cardinal directions. Ritualists sip from a copper bowl and blow a spray through closed lips. Special stone seals of various kinds allow the specialist to make official documents such as talismans. Priests hold a stiff tablet, as if reading from a book. In exorcism rituals, black hats use the sword along with handbells, while red turbans use a horn and a whip.
What would a visitor see if he went to a deist or CCT temple?
Larger traditional Chinese temples, of whatever affiliation, are generally laid out according to the ground plan of ancient imperial residences. Like the palace, the temple enclosure and its main interior structures generally face south. Approaching the temple, the visitor first sees a monumental gateway that offers entry through the temple's surrounding outer wall. Gracefully curved roofs decorated with numerous small multicolored glass or ceramic figures crown the gate as well as the main interior buildings. In some of the more elaborate temples, the main gateway opens into a covered forecourt or a vestibule in which the worshipper can begin to experience the change of mind and calming of the spirit necessary for efficacious devotion. Around the perimeter of the main courtyard one might find small separate halls that function like chapels for devotion to subordinate sacred figures, as well as special features like bell towers. But the focal point of the temple, whether daist or CCT, is typically a freestanding structure in the middle or toward the rear of the main courtyard. A large cauldron or kettle filled with sand, into which devotees insert their offerings of incense sticks, stands 10 or 15 feet away from the main entry to the shrine. At either end of the main building's roofline, and often on the rooflines of other structures in the temple as well, the visitor probably will encounter a curious hybrid aquatic creature, dragon-headed and fish-tailed, called the Jiwen. Popular lore says the exuberant creature protects the building from destruction by fire. Pillars or columns decorated with deeply carved stone dragons, spiraling from bottom to top, often flank the entry to the main shrine. Smaller pillars, similarly decorated, sometimes protrude from the two ends of the roof peaks, columns that support the firmament. Chinese temples typically created a covered space in a portico surrounding the main courtyard and an open space in the courtyard itself. The main shrine may be a fairly large structure, but ordinary worshippers usually make their offerings standing in front of the building, while temple staff perform associated ritual actions closer to the altars within the shrine. Smaller neighborhood or family temples naturally lack the grand architectural layout. Many are tucked away unobtrusively over small business storefronts, or separate single-room structures with folding doors that open the entire width across the front.